Hello and welcome to Tech.0, your popular technology show with Chris and Ben. You're listening to episode 5, released in August 2019. My name is Ben, and as ever, I'm joined by Chris. In this episode, we'll be talking with Dan about online extremism. Let's get to it.
Hi, so today we've got Dan, and I saw Dan present a talk on fighting extremism online at SteelCon, and I thought it'd be good to bring him in here and sort of continue that conversation.
Hello.
So, in your talk, you kind of took us through the history of extremism online. Do you want to sort of set the scene a bit and go through some of that?
Sure. So before the web was a thing, a lot of the communication over the internet and a lot of the foundations for what we have today was done over a system called Usenet, or indeed public bulletin boards. So it's quite important to remember whenever we talk about extremism today, because it's become increasingly relevant, that extremism online isn't exactly a new problem, and it's and indeed, extremists were some of the first groups of people to fully take advantage of the internet, say, because obviously there's like a great deal of incentive for them to do that, because they can't exactly go down the high street and evangelize there. So in 1984, a man called Louis Beam, who was a Grand Dragon of the Texas KKK, created a bulletin board called the Aryan Nations Liberty Net. So essentially this was, from what I can tell, one of the first public discussion forums related around white supremacy on the internet, and this was back in 1984, so that's long before the web, long before anything else. And indeed, a lot of the content on it, they're not terribly imaginative folks, and this did kind of set the scene for a lot of the content that they would put online. So just very general, sharing of old KKK documents, indeed writing articles and things like that sort of thing.
So how big did these was there BBSs you said?
Yes. In terms of the actual user count, we don't really know. It's not very recorded, but they were covered extensively by the press at the time, and indeed they're the ADL, who were the Anti-Defamation League. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're quite instrumental, especially in the early days of extremism, particularly here in the UK with Combat 18 and other Enoch Powell neo-Nazi groups, categorizing them and saying just making it clear that they were hate groups, because we are familiar today with particularly white supremacist groups disguising themselves as other political factions online. This was also the case back then. So the ADL did a fantastic job of indexing the different groups, and there were 5 or 6 by the end of the 80s. So one can presume, judging by a normal BBS, that's easily a couple of thousand users. Which keep in mind, this is before the internet took off. I know a couple of thousand would be a tiny community today, but back then that's significant traffic. Obviously, whether it's tourism or whether it's an internet safari, we don't really know, but we do know that they were popular and they did gain traction, and it wasn't impossible to find them per se.
It was used.
Yes, no, yeah, we do know that. There's a fantastic index online of all of the content on the ADL website, I think, but I don't have the specific link.
So you sort of in the talk tracked through the sort of next 20 years, if not 30 years.
So, I mean, to cut it short, because obviously, as you well know, it fits into an hour-long talk. But basically, after BBS systems and with the invention of the World Wide Web, before we really had the kind of content-driven, user-focused community websites we had now, the KKK, for instance, heavily utilized websites as a form of propaganda to talk about how, for instance, an early one was how a black on white crime was being ignored, and essentially just static websites full of propaganda and full of misinformation regarding certain things, similar to today, of course. And then from there we had Stormfront. I'm not sure you're familiar with it, but it was one of the first major mainstream white supremacy websites. And then this had a couple of thousand members, and that was just an old bulletin board kind of forum, like the type that I'm sure yourself as an admin and a developer you've frequented yourself. The only difference being that it hosted quite different content. And then from there obviously after kind of like very loosely related community like user interface websites, we had like social media and the influx of like user generated content. And like this is huge for the internet, right? Because it's no longer the webmaster is no longer the content creator, and this enables communities to grow, well, essentially as fast as they can be discovered. So this means a great deal to extremists as well, and they kind of changed the focus from like just enabling websites to be a mouthpiece for their views, or like their take on like previous events, or them to share propaganda or old like scripture or whatever. It suddenly became a much more impressive tool for radicalization and recruitment, because you've got like an impossible to moderate scale of traffic. And certainly like an unprecedented growth on these websites, starting with kind of like MySpace, and like leaning on to what we now know with YouTube and Facebook and on on all those sorts of platforms. But we're now seeing kind of a mixture of public, and by public I mean like being like indexed and like you can search for it and find it, all the way through to like private groups, which you need to be invited to, or indeed you need to like someone needs to tell you where to look for them.
How much do you think the drive for more eyeballs from these tech companies has contributed to the ease at which extremism has spread online?
Well, I mean, when you incentivize interaction, right? You're not like it's hard to disincentivize like negative interaction, because I think we'll all agree, and no one at home will disagree either, that there's certain types of content that we do not want to like be a platform for. So, for instance, like if you host illegal content, like your website will get taken down, of course, but like it's not like the police are going to suddenly take down Facebook when they like are slow to moderate a site which is clearly not meant for public consumption. And I think that like without like this kind of external check, like exactly um like what you're talking about, it's they just want more eyeballs. And because the scale of it's so great, the scale of the problem can still be massive, and it will not register on like the level with not on which these people are like their incentives lie, right? Because the only thing that they want is for more people to be on the website. If some of those may happen to join private like arms of extremist political groups, it's not really a big deal. Well, to them at least.
I followed this on Twitter and got the summary of everything, or the interview, I suppose, with Carlos Maza, and he was being attacked.
This is Gay Wonk, correct?
Yes, yeah, he was at Gay Wonk, and he was being attacked by Stephen Crowder, and he called YouTube out on it quite publicly. And not much really happened. They demonetized him, but as we know, that doesn't actually stop the funding.
No, it's quite shocking to me that he wasn't demonetized already, because like if you've been following that as like as closely as I have, there's like a although it is still like an understated kind of explicit racism, it's still there and it's still very prominent.
And there's like stated homophobia in there.
Yeah, there's and this is something that's just quite important to note, because like a lot of people, whenever you talk about, well, the term alternative influencers has started to be used for this kind of network of essentially people who use kind of like branding techniques and advertising techniques to not sell a product, but instead sell like an ideology as part of their like the service that they're doing. So this can obviously include anyone, but for the network that we're talking about, for instance, Steven Crowder and the people who he'll have on the show and the people who he'll trade kind of like tweets with and traction with, is that they maintain this kind of like stoic, well, what we're saying is just something that you don't like. It's not actually hate speech. And I mean, like, I like there's no real getting around it, despite like obviously a lot of these people are libertarian and they believe that like no speech or all speech is free. YouTube does have strict policies on what is allowed on their platform. And I think the battle is that in this conversation about because obviously people have different ideas on speech, it's not even reached the stage where it's debatable yet. We've not even reached the point where we are criminalizing the speech which already has been criminal, or we're acting on the speech which has already been criminalized, right? Like it's not like as you said, like YouTube have not responded very well to this I want to say accusation, but to this realization rather of like homophobic and racist abuse on Steven Crowder's channel. So like they hide themselves behind this like ideological war, right? Because it's like when you feel like you're the underdog and your speech is under attack, it gives you much more of a kind of like a battle cry rather than, oh, I got caught being a racist, so to speak.
And it promotes the two sides kind of mentality of it, where the other interesting bit, I think, from the Reply All episode where he did the interview was the discussion of the changes to the YouTube algorithm, and that they started prioritizing both longer videos and less mainstream videos, so that you would tend to start watching a video, and if you left it on autoplay, you'd move further and further away from the mainstream. Was it the Gangnam? I think you talked about that Gangnam style problem.
There's a lot of terms to describe it, and given that it's kind of a new problem, we've never had to deal with we've never really as a society confronted the inherent problems with like algorithmic suggestions. But essentially, whenever you prioritize interaction, which is as far as we can tell what they're doing, it would make sense that engineers employed to make people use YouTube more would suggest videos which may lead to people using YouTube more. That's not really up for debate so much, but like whenever you have these kind of extremist like fringe views, which are tangentially related to the kind of mainstream content which people consume, because I'm not sure if you're aware, but a study in 2018 saw that YouTube was the most popular site for young adults to receive their news from. The most popular website for news is YouTube, which is quite shocking. And whenever a lot of people enter this conversation, it's like, well, how hard should we police like an entertainment site, right? Because it is like surely no one's getting actual news off this.
I should actually say I get a reasonable amount of news and analysis from,
Yeah, no,
from YouTube.
and of course, but that's the like an analysis I can understand, right? And like think pieces I can understand, but actual like news content, like finding out that things have happened, like especially I don't know if I was like if I knew I was going to be confronted about my beliefs, which I often am, I would definitely at least check another website. But certainly, like not everyone has the time to do that, of course, and not everyone has the interest to do that. Obviously, not many people see themselves as non-political. But what I was saying about algorithmic content, so sorry if I can just finish this point before I lose it. Whenever you prioritize videos which like of those who watch them have extreme engagement, you do tend to prioritize videos which have a smaller group of people who will fanatically watch videos like that, and that does lend itself to more extreme content.
It's not just that. I think it's also moving people towards that content.
Oh no,
Like,
yeah, I know, 100%.
Once you've watched a video one or two times, you're not going to watch it again. Whereas if you can move, maybe you move people in different directions, but you move people, laterally out away from that core content. There is more different content for each individual person to watch.
And that's the thing, and especially when you've got these creators working so closely together, and then like it's viewers of one may well be viewers of another, and that is an intentional part of it. Like brand influencers since the start of social media have been collaborating in order to like share their fan base, right? Because let's say if me and you are selling a product in the same market segment, you might have fans and listeners and buyers who I might not have yet, and the same goes for me. So like if we're both the same level, it's mutually beneficial for us to promote each other. And yeah, and you find these alternative influencers doing the exact same thing, but not all of them are so strict on saying the quiet bit quiet, shall we say? So it 100% it does, I think, lead
Yeah,
to.
and those connections also lead to that. It's often referred to as the pipeline or the funnel or the PewDiePie pipeline I've seen it called, where you'll have someone who's not really that extreme, and they'll do a collaboration with someone a bit more extreme, and a bit more extreme, and a bit more extreme, and a bit more extreme. And no one person is doing anything with anyone that far from their own views. Like everybody's working with people who they broadly agree with, but the whole, like the taken as a system, it can push some people to a very extreme place.
Yeah, and I don't know how much I remember from the talk, but I did mention the push and pull factors of radicalization. So for those who aren't aware, there's people who research this stuff. By this stuff, I mean radicalization, which is the process of someone becoming like acclimatized or becoming tolerant and like accepting of like violent extreme views over time. There tends to be two groups of factors which can lead a person down this path. One being push factors, which push people away from the norms of behavior. So that's like things like discrimination and like forced isolation and indeed like essentially anyone who feels like pushed away from normal society tends to gravitate more towards like extremist content because that's where they find solace, right? And then you've also got like indeed the pull factors because obviously like politics isn't simple, and for these people to provide such a convenient and easy answer, which like makes you feel like it's not actually your fault or you're not doing anything wrong or there's nothing there's nothing to learn. Like it can be quite appealing, and like it's no wonder that this is such an effective tool for like violent extremists.
Also, I think the YouTube example particularly is interesting because it kind of shows one of the situations where we kind of, I think we have to make trade-offs. Having a long tail, having lots of lots of availability for people to be YouTubers and to promote their content in isolation sounds like a great sort of situation to be in. It sounds really good for people if you can trust the content people are making, and that doesn't mean everyone has to be the same, but yeah, as long as it's not at the, the extreme violent ends. But how do you think we should manage that trade off?
To be honest, you use the phrase like trust the content. I don't even like wouldn't, and this might be unpopular, and like I'm not sure how many people would agree with me in principle, and I'm sure like there's perfectly valid reasons for not doing so. But I don't even think that federating the content to the point where you can trust it would be a good idea because that would imply some kind of like process on YouTube for them to like verify like each bit of content which is uploaded to their site, and and I think that like and free speech advocates make this like argument all the time that YouTube's benefit is in its kind of spontaneity, and like social media works because of the community, and if you like federate that and you put barriers in the way of people producing that content, the content simply won't get made or it'll go elsewhere. So either it does us no good or we lose like such like a valuable service. And while I do think there needs to be trade-offs in terms of like, yeah, we should stop a community growing if it's outright like if it's literally spreading like hate speech.
So you'd wait until it crosses a certain
I
threshold.
mean, it sounds that's a very that's a very cynical way to put it, but yes, like essentially we do need to um wait and see if it does develop to that point. But I think I would not draw the point like the point where most people would.
I think the more interesting that I'm got there is who draws that point. Like,
That's exactly the problem as well, right? Because right now, but I mean, right now, nobody draws the point. Right now, it
well,
happens.
YouTube kind of do, but
Well, I know. I mean, when YouTube will decide, but as we've seen, they'll only decide when there is a big enough pushback out there. They're like in like unless it is explicitly indefensibly hate speech, YouTube will not get rid of it. And I think the only reason for that is because that they would like see a tangible loss to their platform if they were seen openly enabling explicit hate speech. So, like I think we need a more granular line to be drawn. And I mean, like I guess I don't know who draws that, but there needs to be someone independent of the incentives which are there for extremists to continue their work on these platforms, because regardless of which way you look at it, there's no denying that there are incentives for YouTube to not to like for inaction essentially, right? Because like not only are there barriers to properly moderating content on a like mass social media platform like YouTube, because like you've got to like employ people to do it, and you've got to set up the processes, and you've got to make sure it's accountable, and once you do start to federate content like that, there's a risk of you becoming a publisher who's much more liable. And if we refer back to the talk again, the story of two dial-up providers in the 90s, CompuServe and Prodigy. So CompuServe refused to regulate any content on its service whatsoever, while Prodigy actually hired a team of moderators to do exactly this to make sure that like no like inappropriate or I'm pretty sure the motivation behind this was pornography, because that was essentially the internet version of the Red Scare at the time. But the issue was that both did face legal challenges for content that was hosted on their service, and while CompuServe was not deemed responsible, Prodigy actually was successfully litigated against because of this moderation. And
yeah,
like I
they.
think
So this is, I think it's US law, but they lose common carrier status, don't
yeah,
they?
yeah, and there's a big distinction between like a carrier and a publisher, and like indeed it's about the expectation of whether you can reasonably expect someone to believe that that content was so a newspaper would definitely be a publisher while a mail carrier would not, so to speak.
I wonder if moderation of that content should be independent to the companies. Like, and the producers of the content. Like, I don't think the companies can be unbiased about it. Yeah, I could imagine some sort of you can't really get people to do it voluntarily. It's a difficult one. I suppose you can set policy voluntarily, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing is making the disincentives for enabling extremist content way more than the incentives of keeping it on. So regardless of how you do that, I'm sure there's a thousand ways. So like for instance, we're recording this just off the back of the FTC fine for Facebook for 5 billion for privacy violations. So like we do hold companies to account on how they treat their platforms. Like we do. There's no ifs, there's no buts. This isn't government overreach, but it's about treating extremism online. It's about treating the threat of this kind of like unfederated content, like treating that of like as much of a threat as privacy violations are, which I would definitely argue it is. It is a hard argument because then we have to we need to talk about content-based bans, and we need to talk about certain things that you're allowed to make videos about, and then obviously there's the problem of satire and ironic fascism and all this sort of stuff. So it's not an easy
Well,
conversation. by any means.
no. There's always a very difficult line to draw, and I think that line needs to be drawn very carefully. I suppose the other issue I'd like to talk about, it might get a bit sensitive, but there's a definite difference in how the media and governments think about right wing extremism, particularly alt right extremism, and Islamic extremism. And yeah, like one I feel gets taken a lot more seriously. It also tends to be covered under terrorism laws, which may apply, may not apply as appropriate.
It is so it is an interesting problem because there is a legal distinction, at least in the US anyway, between homegrown violent extremism and like international terrorism organizations, which is a federated difference. And indeed, it's there was a case earlier. I think there was a viral video about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez questioning an FBI commissioner regarding the like designation of like terrorism versus like mass murder, and as essentially she was asking why. And while the Pulse nightclub shooter was if I remember correctly, I haven't read it since I was researching for the talk, but essentially the difference was that whenever someone acts on behalf of a terrorist organization which has clear objectives and statements, that's much easier to like go under the law of political terrorism than like just a seemingly random internet inspired mass murder.
Which is what the alt right, for want of a better term, that's what they want. They don't want to be liable. They don't want to be responsible.
So, actually, interestingly enough, I do feel like it's relevant to go back to our friend Lewis Beam in the 1980s. If For those of us with poor memory like myself, he was the Grand Dragon who set up LibertyNet. He was also a massive proponent of this tactic called leaderless resistance. And what this was, this kind of strategy came from kind of like Secret Service organization and how spies would operate. Essentially, you've got a political wing of an organization, let's talk about the KKK in this instance, who claims to separate themselves entirely from the violent extremism of that same kind of objective, in this case white supremacism. So you'd have the KKK who are arguing for the supremacy of white people in a purely political standpoint. So they run for office, they flyer, they have organizations and businesses who work legally, or at least did at the time. And then there's another layer which is closely linked with this organization in terms of ideology, but refuses to affiliate itself with them. Whenever it comes to taking responsibility for violent actions and things like that. So you do have almost a hydra of difficulty there, because naturally the intimidation and and then the reasons behind the political violence still work, but they can't actually be drawn back to the people who are driving the rhetoric behind it and who are fueling the anger. And indeed, Lewis Beam himself did advocate for people to operate individually or in small groups, which is what we've seen happen with white supremacist terror in the US more recently, and in the US and Europe, should I say.
And it's possible now for very small groups of people to have a significant influence through the fact that they can actually get an audience, a significant audience.
100%, and we've seen just how easy, and how like spontaneous that can be with shootings like Christchurch and Poway and the Tree of Life and so on.
Ben, you've been unusually quiet.
This is all something that I am sort of peripherally aware of, if you like. I haven't done reading into it. You hear bits of it on social media. You hear bits of it in the news. And so I suppose, partly for my benefit and partly for anyone else, a good question might be very broadly, what is extremism and what are the kinds of extremism that we can sort of relate to and hear about?
So, and it is a good question, and I guess it is like important to establish the foundations of this. And whenever I talk about extremism, I tend to mistakenly, obviously, use the terms violent extremism and extremism kind of like interchangeably, because the extremism that we talk about whenever we like refer to like violent political ideology tends to be uh, tends to be classed as violent extremism, and violent extremism is simply the set of beliefs which enable someone to justify or advocate for politically or otherwise ideologically motivated violence, again to further like some kind of religious or like political aim. So, groups that we've seen who would qualify as like violent extremists are obviously kind of Al Qaeda, the IRA, ISIS, and indeed white supremacy in the modern day.
And I suppose then that those are really good examples of violent extremists, and then extremists without the violence isn't necessarily any more innocent.
So it's a tricky one, because like I'm assuming what you're referring to as non-violent extremism is simply the advocacy of these like fringe political beliefs, but just without the will to impose them using violence. And like that's a tricky one, because even the statement of like again, if we take white supremacy for example, even the statement of saying I want a separate state for white people. Like I like for like if we take the KKK, the ultimate goal is again America for Americans, right? And while that might not be physical violence, it still like clearly falls under the purview of violent extremism, because like while they're not advocating for it using guns and hammers and hatchets, the end goal of that political kind of ideology and indeed what the group is striving for, like as far as we can tell, is violent, because there's no way that you can have like in this case talking about the KKK again, there's no you cannot have a white America without violence, right? Like it does subjugate.
You require violence to be able to enact their political goals.
And this is the same for the IRA and for ISIS as it stands, right? Because like, you can't unite Ireland without like getting rid of the current government, or lack of, considering we haven't had one for 2 years. But certainly like it's when it like violent extremism is like a political outlook, and the phrase extremism itself just like isn't something which is politically orientated. Like I can be a hummus extremist, and that just means that I have very extreme or radical or like particularly out there views about a certain
I'm a
subject. So
I'm a ketchup extremist.
yeah, I know, so I know 100%, and we all have things that like obviously in the modern vernacular we wouldn't use the term extremism to describe them, but whenever we go back to what extremism actually means, it's just a fringe or is like socially unaccepted or like just general radical view about something. So I'm specifically talking about violent extremism because there are types even of political extremism which aren't particularly violent. For instance, you have like absolute pacifism, right? Like that's an extreme view to hold yourself to never cause harm to another person, like and have that as part of your political ideology. That is still extremism. It's just naturally law enforcement isn't concerned about it because you're not going to have a pacifist bombing. So
I
we
suppose
we tend to.
ultimately we're talking about dangerous extremism, aren't we?
This gets people worried because then, of course, that just highlights the problem. Who defines what dangerous is, right? Because like if I sell coal, solar is going to be dangerous to me, right? So then it's like, oh, then what kind of extremism is bad again? So it does. No, I do like the phrasing because it does highlight the problem we have with actually taking action on this, because it's such a minefield in terms of like or civil liberties.
You do have to have someone to draw that line. I don't think we've got any organizations or groupings at the moment that make sense. Maybe the judicial system is like the closest.
Yeah, well, I mean, like currently we do have. Well, I mean, like to the extent we're not terribly good at sort of quashing this kind of speech online, but whenever it comes to like deciding what constitutes violent extremism, we do have like mechanisms in place to designate extremist groups, and that is currently h- like how we like differentiate people who are like violently extreme and those who aren't. So, like for better or for worse.
I was going to say, I suppose it is then a case of, in the way that our laws reflect or are supposed to reflect the current norms of society, the current accepted norms of society. I suppose you could have direct and indirect dangerous extremism, because you could have something that isn't inherently violent, but it pushes or pulls the norms towards it, leading towards something that is violent or dangerous in the end. And also, worryingly at the same time, therefore, if it's done over a period of time, distorts or pulls the social norms, so that actually the judicial system, that just becomes the norm.
Yeah, and this is like, and I mean you've summed it up better than I could. Like this kind of gradual pull towards like the worst acts possible essentially is what we've seen previously when it comes to like particularly violent political ideologies. So like whenever scholars look at like Nazism in the 1930s and 40s, they don't start with Hitler's first political victory, right? They look beyond that and they go, okay, how was this normalized, and how did we get to here to enable this guy to like gain political support? Because like it's an uncomfortable truth, but he won votes from normal people. He won votes from like people like you and I who lived in a system which made that kind of like xenophobia acceptable. And like I'd obviously like situations like this, whenever you discuss the social reasons which lead to like people like the Nazis gaining power, you need to do it very, very carefully. And I'm certainly not qualified to discuss it, but you're exactly right that that is the danger, and that is what the and that is what the industry of combating or countering violent extremism tries to work to prevent. It's that kind of like catching the precursors, like the othering of certain groups and the normalization of violence as part of a political process and things like this.
You're talking for the political geeks out there, it's the Overton window. The
Yes.
Overton window is like the bounds of acceptable discussion, and if you can move it, you can move like the average sort of political viewpoint of an entire culture.
Do you think that there is anything that we can do, the individuals can do on these platforms? A lot of these platforms will have report buttons, and I'm sure that we've all used them and had a message back from whatever platform it is saying, we reviewed your comment and find no fault.
Yeah, this does not conflict with our community standards.
I'm guessing that if enough people did, but then again, I suppose that's maybe not very good either.
So I mean, there are problems with seeking to use existing methods of kind of like currently accepted methods of reporting political extremism, because they like none of them are perfect and a lot of them do have their flaws. And I think what we can do in terms of individuals, in terms to be the most impactful, is to kind of like, we've all got our own little bubble where this kind of stuff starts. And as much as we'd like to think that like violent killers and people who genuinely believe that like the violent oppression of others is acceptable, like this all starts at home. Like, so I think just being careful about the rhetoric that we ourselves say, and like being like mindful of the language we use and the like political ideas that we have, and seeking to share that with the people closest to us. I do think that that's kind of how an individual can make a difference, because although there like there are things to say, like for instance the Facebook, like it's very common for both sides now. The Proud Boys, who are a violent white supremacist group in the US, and now use mass reporting as a way to get things taken down. So it started out as a anti-fascist tactic actually, and actually to like garner popular support through like mediums of like media pages and like email threads to say, hi everyone, click report on this, because if enough people do, it will get hidden and then someone will have to look at it. But it works both ways, right? Because anyone with a big audience can point a large number of clicks at something and say, yeah, report this until it's down. So I certainly couldn't advocate for that.
I'd like to add something. Yeah, I think you kind of touched on it already, but being mindful of the content you're watching, being aware that they have a bias that may not be in your best interest. What was that? There's a Terry Pratchett quote, I think it is, of the problem with having an open mind is people want to come along and put things in it. And I thought that was a great way of describing it.
It's certainly apt, but then I mean, it's just as much that as it is like just taking ownership of the fact that we do have these biases and like and taking ownership of the fact that whenever these like political groups do seek to like radicalize people and do seek to like recruit people into their in into their circle, they are coming with valid concerns. Like they do, like for instance in the UK, it's quite common for the far right in this country to prey on like financial uncertainty, and indeed like attempt to exacerbate problems which exist in our current system. The most common being that they'll pick a public service, whether it's like I don't know, like local transport or the NHS or welfare or social housing, and then they'll point at a particular group and say that that group are responsible for the strain being caused. And now suddenly it's not actually as like a xenophobic feeling that's causing it, but it's indeed like financial uncertainty has and if they're not informed, or indeed if they don't have time to like fact check that, it's not exactly like impossible to believe. So I like and again it comes down to our own circle. So like whenever people around me like talk in that sort of way, which like I'm fortunate enough to have learnt with that, it's like a lot of this concern has been planted by people who are acting in bad faith, who do have views which are not in the interest of you and I try and take the time to say, well, actually, that's not true. Here's a very easy source for that. Or, well, do you not see that this is the wrong person to blame? Or I don't know, just things like that. I'm a big advocate of personal activism when it comes, but obviously
I think
I've got
effective personal activism. You've got to communicate well and clearly to people and persuasively. Yeah.
yeah, no, it's I mean I do, but that being said, you owe nothing to randomers online who seek to again move that window of acceptable discussion and mask their own kind of bigotry in this like pseudo concern, which happens quite a lot because they've realized they get banned if they say the quiet bit out loud.
Something else I'd like to add to that is I feel that certainly my generation were raised to sort of feel that they could do whatever they wanted, that the world was open to them, and they could have pretty much any career they wanted. And I can kind of understand how someone who gets into goes through school, finds that they didn't quite get the grades to get into uni, takes a not a great job. The global recession hits. It's gone on for 10 years. You can kind of understand in that point how they would be feeling angry. That's not justifying some of the actions taken, but they also get preyed upon. That sort of disenfranchised person is very vulnerable to new ideas, also bad ideas.
Just before we move on there, it's important to remember that this is not a kind of like education thing or a class thing. It is indeed every single person gets wrapped up in this, and like it's not like an error of judgment. And like I certainly think that given like I could be born with the exact same kind of faculties I have right now, and certainly fall into a lot of the same traps that these people have, just out of the like I feel quite fortunate because I feel like I've met the right people and I've been given the right kind of context, and I had all those benefits to like really put the research into things like this. But obviously like not everyone can, so or nor not everyone wants to even.
So, if our listeners wanted to learn more about this or to read more around the subject, are there places, are there people that you feel it would be good to go to
Yeah.
seek more information?
So, like, certainly, as a lot of this is kind of contemporary media, there's naturally a lot of contemporary media about this subject, and indeed, as you were saying earlier, like phrases like the PewDiePie pipeline and the pipeline of extremism, the alt-right pipeline, so things like that, where like have a lot of kind of documentation around how this problem manifested, and indeed how we've ended up in kind of a situation where people with fringe politics and views, but not necessarily violent, can be persuaded into that through the use of like algorithmic content suggestion and other things. And there's also the Data Society have done a fantastic paper called Alternative Influences, which zeroes in on that group of people we were talking about earlier, who have employed kind of like brand influencer techniques to sell part of like what I'd call an ideology, right? So it's called Alternative Influence, and it's available on the datasociety.net. And it's probably one of the only reports I've read 4 or 5 times, just because it is incredible, the amount of work that's gone into it. And I'd feel you're missing out if you don't read it, truly.
Is there anywhere that we can direct people to find you?
So I'm D4N_tweets on Twitter, and I suppose you can also find me on LinkedIn.
Thanks a lot for your time. It's been great having you on.
Thank you very much, guys, for having me on. Cheers.
Thanks for listening. You can follow us on Twitter at tech_point_0. We hope you join us again for the next episode.